Okay, hi and welcome. This is part two of a conversation we have started in a different video where we talked about developing a corporate podcasting show. In case you're watching this video for the first time, but you haven't watched part one, I would recommend you go there because we talked about some of the foundational aspects of developing a corporate podcasting show. So start with part one first. In case you are here with us and you've been here with us before, then you should know us by now. I'm Yanni Lunga, that's Connie Steele. And Connie, are you ready to continue our conversation on developing a corporate podcasting show?
Absolutely, ready to rock and roll.
Perfect. So while in the first part, we looked more at the strategy and planning aspects, in the second part, it makes sense to look at the more, let's use the term, creative side of putting together a corporate podcasting show. And I think when it comes to that, one of the first things that come to mind is music. So Connie, what is your take on finding music for a corporate podcasting show? Any advice you have to share?
I think when you think of music, it has to tie back to your brand. We spent a lot of time in the part one section, just really understanding, what is your business objective? What are you about? How is that tied to your brand strategy? And so this is no different. You need to be strategic when you think about building your podcast, your show. It's a reflection of who you are. So before you say, oh, I like this kind of genre or I like this kind of style because it's your personal preference, you need to take a step back and say, what is my company about? What do we stand for? What is that brand character, for example? What is that tone? How does the music best align to that brand foundation? Because that sound is a reflection of your company. So if the way you would describe your company is one that is about being fun and inspiring, then you probably want to pick music that has a certain level of energy and tempo to it. And another thing is, if your company tends to be progressive and contemporary, then you want to find music that aligns to that. But in contrast, if your company is one that is a much more serious, steady type of organization, then finding something that is oriented more towards pop music or hip hop or has certain musical instruments, the musical instruments that you use and so forth, it's just not going to fit. They're like, wait a second, this seems odd and off. And what are you trying to be? So for me, picking the music ties back to that brand foundation. What about you, Jan? What do you think is really important?
I just really love what you shared, Connie, because I've actually have to admit that I've had my fair share of podcasts that I've listened to where I've been like, I'm not a music critic by no means, but sometimes I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure if that's the genre I would have gone with, to be honest. And I think, as you said, it's important to always look back. For me, I say to look, as you said, at the brand, at what the company stands for. I also talk about the overall style of the show, because I think the right kind of soundtrack, for example, for a podcast can really sets the mood for people as they begin their listening experience. It can also be a great way to say goodbye in a way to listeners, but the wrong music genre can just turn your show into something that they're like, well, this sounds just like hundreds of other podcasts that I've listened to. I think one thing that it's also worth adding to the conversation, since we're talking about music, has to do with sound effects. So for example, if for the style of podcast you're planning for your company, you would want to also have some kind of sounds, you can go about it two ways. One is to actually record them by yourself. So let's say if they are, for example, office sounds that you would want to use in your podcast. So maybe it's somebody typing on a keyboard, a phone ringing, somebody walking in the office or something like that. You can record them with a recorder, with a microphone, or you can also purchase them. There are different websites where you can purchase sounds. They have some bundles. So maybe they say, for example, office sounds, and there is 50 different sounds, but you can even purchase the individual sound. And the same applies for music. There are different places you can purchase music. It's important to make a disclaimer. Neither of us is an attorney, so it's always important that you do your due diligence when it comes to the research, that you read about the licenses of the music or sounds you purchase for your show. Because I know, for example, a site I've used in the past is called Audio Jungle, and they have different levels. They have different licenses. So you need to make sure that you read and you select the one that is the most appropriate for your circumstance. Another website, which is probably newer than compared to Audio Jungle, but it's specific to podcasting, is called podcastmusic.com. It's a subscription-based subscription-based website, and you can check it out because there is music that it's ready basically to use for your podcast. So I think, Connie, you gave some great tips in terms of what to think about when it comes to the music for the show or even the soundtrack. And I just share a couple of different ways one can get access to music. Anything you want to add, Connie? Perhaps any other platform or resource you want to share when it comes to the music component of a corporate podcast?
I'd say the last thing, just to add to it, is that you can obviously go to these stock music sites. There are a ton, just like there are stock imagery sites. So you can get these different stems, so to speak. So from a song, you've got different variants of that particular piece of music that you could use, but you can also do original music too. So it really is two paths. It is first starting off with what is the right kind of sound that aligns to your brand. And then you have to say, you know what, is that something that I can just find through a stock music location, which is going to be less expensive? Or do you really want to invest and create your own original sound? That just becomes part of your brand and you can use it for other things. So that's sort of that two-part decision. Now, creating your own music is going to be more expensive, but it's very unique to you. And so when people listen to your podcast, they're always going to recognize, wow, that is uniquely this company. So that could be a benefit too. And I think another thing that we wanted to talk about as well is voiceover talent, right? So just like picking the right music is so important to set the mood, the voiceover talent that you have, who that host is going to be, absolutely is the same thing. How many times have we listened to podcasts? I'm sure, Jan, you felt this way, where as soon as you start listening to it, the energy level is really great because that person just brings their whole selves to it and they just have this kind of rhythm and pace and you just really get into the show. But then there are others where it falls flat because a lot of it is the host. So with that in mind, what recommendations do you have, Jan, when it comes to organizations finding the right voiceover talent for their podcast?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as you said, it's a very important piece of the puzzle as well. Now, I wouldn't say that the right or wrong voiceover artist would make or break your show. However, as I said earlier, for music, I can say the same for voiceover artists. Sometimes it has happened to me to listen to some podcasts and I've asked myself, why did they choose this person? Not against the artist, him or herself, but sometimes, for example, I listen to a show that I know for a fact caters to an American audience, and the voiceover, the intro is made by somebody who has an Australian accent, for example. I'm like, yeah, I wonder why.
I've heard that too.
Yeah, and maybe you even know what you're referring to. And I'm like, yeah, I wonder what was that led them to pick that specific person. So first and foremost, some of the basics has to do again with what you said earlier for music, about the brand, the company, the value, and then also about the show and who is your show for. So for example, if you're creating a show that mainly addresses a female audience, in my head, it does make sense to have a female voiceover artist. If it caters to primarily a male audience, then you may want to go with a male voiceover artist. That's kind of the very basics. Now, to add to it, I think you want to also ask yourself, what do we want that segment where we have the voiceover artist to do? So do we want that to be something that is quite generic, that discusses the show in more general terms? Or perhaps we want something where every episode starts with a bumper where there is some generics, but then there's something that is tailored to the specific episode. Because if you want to go for the latter, it means that you may want to find somebody that you can work with on a regular basis. Because if you say, well, the person is going to be on call for us, you may be surprised that they tell you, sorry, I have a bunch of other projects I'm working on. I can't do it before next month or next quarter. And that may be a problem. In my experience, the way I've gone about voiceover artists, I've always thought about the brand, the style of the show, and the mood I want that person to set for a person who tunes in. So, for example, for the very first podcast I launched, which is a music business podcast, is called the Jazz Spotlight. Since there is the word jazz in it and it features jazz artists, it made sense to have, first of all, a song that went in the jazz direction. But secondly, as we're talking voiceover artists, have somebody, a man who had quite a deep voice, who I really felt kind of suited that style perfectly. For the podcast that followed, the 360 Entrepreneur podcast, the business podcast, it was completely different approach. The music was different, was more upbeat, faster. The person has a more, let's say, bubbly. Actually, I take that back. It's not that the person had a more bubbly personality, is that I was looking for somebody with a more bubbly personality. I think now that I said this, and I said it aloud, I think that what I would encourage companies do is, instead of saying, well, let's try to find a voiceover artist and listen to his or her style, I would say, make a sort of identikit of what that person sounds like. So, for example, are they native speakers or are they foreigners? If they're native speakers, where are they from? Is it from the US? Is it from Canada? If your podcast is in English, is it from the UK? Is it from Scotland? Is it from Australia? And then, do you want a person with a deeper voice, with a louder voice? You want somebody who you can tell from the voice it's a relatively young person? You want somebody who's a bit older? I would try to make an identikit first without listening to anybody, so that then you can go ahead and try to listen and compare different voiceover artists. Because otherwise, I think going just into research mode right away by listening, you may find yourself at a standstill at some point because you have so many options. So I would say start by leaving out the audio dimension for a second and write down who would you want to be the voiceover artist. So think about the language, their voice, their gender, an approximate age range, if that's something that you want to pay attention to. And then you can say, okay, we want somebody who's upbeat, who speaks slower, who speaks very quickly. There is really so many nuances you may want the voiceover artist to have. But I would say start by writing down his or her traits. Connie, what are your thoughts on this? And obviously, one thing that I should add is that you may have the voiceover person in-house. It may be you, it may be the host, or it may be somebody who isn't hosting the podcast, but for whatever reason, you think he or she would be the perfect fit for the introduction and the outro of each episode.
So I'm going to piggyback on everything that you said, and particularly the one where you might have the talent in-house. And I would personally recommend that for those looking to build a corporate podcast, align, again, that brand foundation, who is, know what your brand character is, right? Mm-hmm. And that identity that you want to convey, and who in your company fits that. Who could be that host or that voiceover talent that could fit? There's a couple of different ways that you could do it. But when I think of voiceover talent, I also think of, who could really host this show? Because in a lot of ways, who you pick to host that is a reflection of your company. And right. So of the people on your team, who are looking to do this podcast, even though they've conceived it, maybe just their style might not be the right fit, but it doesn't mean that they can't direct the strategy. But you might need talent that actually carries forth that level of energy and tempo that you talked about. This still just gets back to, again, the objective that you're trying to accomplish, the brand that you're trying to convey. What's the best way to express it? And then when you start to lay that out, there's like, all right, there's an intro piece. Do we want to have separate voiceover Tom for that? And then who's the host? When I think of voiceover Tom, there's also who's the host that runs the show. And so are they the right person? Certainly there are ways where sometimes people outsource these things. Certainly not something I would recommend for a company. It's a reflection of you. Pick the right person in your company who would be, again, that host, and the voiceover talent to just maybe do the intro, outro. To your point, again, that goes back to being strategic. So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think when you look at for most things, you have an inward approach. So you look at having somebody in-house doing these things first. Everything is smoother and faster because you can maybe see the person in person. You can sit down multiple times. You can have multiple recording sessions, try, let's tweak this, let's tweak that. But if you're outsourcing it to somebody who maybe is on the other side of the world, chances are they're working on a multiple or multitude of projects, and they may tell you, well, okay, but I only do one revision. And if you're not satisfied with that, you just need to either find somebody else or pay them more or something along those lines. So I think that once you have decided what that voiceover talent would look like or sound like, you can even develop already the script. So what would they be saying in the intro, in the outro? If you have some segments with ads and you want to have the voiceover artist discuss those, what would they say in those few seconds? And then you want to think about the music, the song or songs you've picked. Which is the segment of the song where the voiceover artist would be introducing, for example, the episode. And then you just take, okay, this is the let's say 30 seconds. This is what we would want you to say. And this is how we would want you to say. So say it by speaking quickly, slowly, whatever. And then just have the person try a couple of times and see how that sounds. And I think you'll be surprised by how professional somebody who has never done this may sound with just the right guidance. So, for example, with having a script, with them being able to listen to the song and say, okay, this is what I'm gonna be talking over, or what's gonna be in the background when I talk. And then if they know more about the show, about the audience, it will be easier for them to know how to approach the whole thing. Whereas when you're outsourcing to somebody, and I've outsourced mine, it may be harder to get the person to understand what you would want them to do, because the show has this approach and talks to this audience, and our brand and company values are about these kind of topics. Another piece to the puzzle here, Connie, that I think it makes sense for us to touch upon has to do with the visual side of the podcast, which is the artwork. What I have some tips, and there is one in particular that it's very useful to see how or whether your artwork stands out. But before I share that, I want to hand it over to you. Anything you have to say when it comes to picking the quote unquote perfect artwork for a corporate podcast show?
When you talk about anything creative, to say what's the perfect thing can be tough, because a lot of times it gets down to this perception of it's my personal preference, right? So to alleviate yourself within an organization where somebody's like, oh, I like this creative direction versus another creative direction versus another, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but this still all goes back to what is that brand foundation, right? So the expression visually of that podcast in your episode art, in the quote tiles you may do, in those audiograms, have to align to sort of the visual identity, hopefully, of what you've already developed for your company. So it's a template. What you're doing is now just expressing your brand through a different channel. So if you already have a color palette that's been defined, because that's what your company's color palette is, you have a typography, you have certain imagery, it's leveraging that to stay consistent, right? Because what you're trying to do is showcase who you are. Just like if you're a person, you're an individual, for you to constantly change your identity in different spaces and places that you're in, it just feels inconsistent. It's like, wait, well, who really are you as a person? It's no different, right? For you as a company, putting yourself out there and all the content and offerings you've got, you got to be consistent. So showcase that visual expression of you for the podcast in a way that aligns back to your brand. So that's really kind of the main thing I would say at the most strategic level. That's where it all starts. What about you, Jan? What would you add?
I agree 100% with what you said, Connie. And I'm just going to add to what you said. So really take what Connie just shared and what I'm about to share and make the most of it. The first thing I would say is don't put your face on the podcast artwork if it doesn't make any sense. So if the podcast is about the company, it may not make sense to add. I know, I think as people, we kind of, or most of us say, yeah, it's nice to get exposure. But for me, for some of my podcasts, for example, the Jazz Spotlight, I'm on the artwork in a kind of artistic way. I had an artist who kind of made something, so it looks different. But for all the other ones, I'm not there. It doesn't have my face being on the artwork doesn't add anything at all. I think it much more powerful to have, for example, the company logo, perhaps an icon or something that expresses what the podcast is about. So if a person were to stumble upon that artwork without any text to add context to it, they would be able to say, oh, this looks like a podcast about technology because I see this icon, or this looks like a podcast about podcasting because I see the icon of, I don't know, a microphone or headphones or something along those lines. So I think it's important to really try to make the most out of that. So don't try to, I mean, a good example of this is the very famous podcast Startup. Their artwork, it has changed over the years, but there's always been, or has always had a very, let's say, minimalistic approach, but it's really stood out. So I think often there is this idea of wanting to add to the artwork. So to have the title of the podcast, to have the company logo, and to have somebody's face, and to have 10 different icons. Sometimes the less, the better. So I would say the name of the podcast definitely makes sense, especially if your company isn't a company that is known worldwide. I mean, if your company were, I don't know, Google, most people would know, yeah, it's Google, so it's Google's podcast. But if your company, maybe you're a startup or it's relatively new, or you may think, well, not most people who use Spotify or another podcasting app would know about us, then you can also add your company logo and the name of the podcast. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things. One has to do with fonts. You want to make sure that the font you use for your artwork is something that can be read when the artwork is small. So don't just say, we like this font, so we're going to use that. Make sure that that font can be read when the artwork is small, because on our devices like smartphones, the artworks are relatively small typically. So there is that. About the color, you said it, Connie. Start with your brand color palette. That makes sense. I would say the only exception to that is if you feel that your company brand colors wouldn't really stand out, then you may want to think of, okay, maybe let's use something different that stands out. Now, how do you actually pick something that stands out? There is a sort of experiment test you can do that is very simple. You can do this with a tool like Canva, for example, canva.com. just go to whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts, go with your computer, it's better, and take a screenshot of a section that has multiple podcast artworks. Practical example, the new and noteworthy section of Apple Podcasts, you just take a screenshot there and you have, let's say, 10 artworks, 12 artworks. Great. Now upload that to Canva and then upload what you consider your podcast artwork. Or if you have, maybe you are not sure, you're torn between 2 or 3 versions or 3 different concepts, upload each of them. And then just replace one of the artworks in the screenshot with yours. So probably the artworks in the screenshots are going to be smaller than your artwork. So you just decrease its size, you just lay it over so that it covers one of those shows. And then just take a look at it. Does your artwork stand out or does it just blend in with all the other ones? Perhaps if it just blends in, you may want to consider using a different color. Can the font be easily read? Or is the font that you use the right one because the title can be easily read? Yes, no. And if you are torn between 2 or 3 different concepts, same thing applies. Which is the concept that seems to be standing out the most? It's the same for you, Connie, that you're an author, and the book cover, it's the same thing. How many times we've been at a library, at a bookstore, where some books just seem to blend in together because the covers maybe have similar colors or the concepts are the same, and maybe they are from different or by different authors. And I think it's important. I mean, you can always update the artwork, you can always change it. It's important to have some consistency with your brand, from the color, from the concept, from the font, but at the same time, if possible, also try to make it stand out, because true, we are talking about audio here, but we do judge a book by its cover, and a good artwork is gonna help you attract listeners. Then maybe they listen to the podcast, they say, this is not my cup of tea. But at least initially, they are gonna scroll through the different apps and the different sections. And if your artwork just blends in, it may not get noticed. But if it stands out, things are different.
Completely agree. Now we got one more topic that we wanted to cover too, when we're talking about what you need to know to build your podcast. And that is related to publishing cadence. So many of you who have potentially started looking at podcasts may have heard different things where I need to publish my show every week, or maybe for some people, they publish it as frequently as a couple times per week, or almost Johnny Lee Dumas, which that's tough. He does it every day. Now that is one serious extreme, right. But what is the right publishing cadence for your company? And so I'll just kind of leave it with my point of view here, is that this really comes down to the level of effort that you believe your team can manage. Because even though what you might have heard is that, oh, you know what, to build a podcast is simple. We've talked about how actually it's quite involved. Right. And there are so many different pieces to it that you don't want to make this a headache for yourself. It's supposed to be fun and creative, but the necessary planning has to take in, you have to take that into account. So in some cases, it's okay if it's once a month. If that's all you can do, then do that. But the key thing is consistency. So to determine what's best for you, it really comes down to what does your team feel they can realistically manage, and figure out if that's every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, every month. But some of that cadence not only is predicated on the amount of work your team can handle, but within your industry, maybe the pace of information and news might be such that you can get away with once a month. Or maybe it's something which, because it's evergreen, it's not a big deal. But other industries might be where it's really timely. You want to get out information on a more frequent basis. So those are things to ultimately consider. So Jan, what else would you add to that?
Yeah, you made some very good points. I think it's really easy to get, let's say, influenced by what others are doing. But as you said, it's important to start to look at what are we going to be, realistically speaking, able to do on a consistent basis. Is it weekly? Is it every second week? Is it every month? Start with that. And also keep in mind that there are different formats your show may have. We talked about formats in a different video. So if you're actually, your company is considering different formats right now, you can watch that video and you're going to get more insights from us in terms of what are some of the things to consider for the different formats. But it's important to keep in mind that you can have, for example, a season-based podcast where you say, okay, we have a season now, and then season 2, it's next quarter. So we have really time to produce it. And like TV shows, for example. So you have some time in between the seasons. In other cases, you may say, well, we're going to have a season-based approach, but we won't have that much time in between season 1 and season 2. So you say, our seasons are more series of episodes. So we say, in this next season, which is a 3-part series, we're going to cover this topic. And then in a couple of weeks, we have a new episode series, which is 5 episodes long, and we're going to talk about this topic, or we're going to cover the same topic, but from a different angle. I think there isn't really a wrong way to go about it, as long as it's manageable for your company. If you're just trying, like you mentioned, John Lee Dumas, that's a good example. If you're just trying to say, let's just do like he does and publish every day, you're going to probably get to burnout really quickly. It's better to publish not as frequently, but on a regular basis in terms of being able to deliver, instead of just trying to do like others and say, yeah, let's publish all the time. And keep in mind something that you, Connie, say often, publish once, syndicate many. Even if you say, well, we're only going to publish once a month, but how are we going to be able to make the content work for us? Well, you can repurpose it. So sure, your podcast may have only an episode or a new episode each month, but that one episode is also going to be turned into audiograms, into clips, if it's a video show you're producing, into written content. So from that one piece of content, you actually be able to cover many different bases on different platforms as well. So don't think that because many are publishing, for example, daily or weekly, and your company isn't going to publish daily or weekly, that they are going to be heard and you are going to be ignored, because it's not about the quantity, but it's really about quality and strategy.
100% agree. So to close, hopefully all of you have found this incredibly helpful, and we always have valuable resources for you to learn more about really the ins and outs of corporate podcasting, from conceiving the idea, concepting it, all the way through execution. Go to flywheelassociates.com/podcasting, where you're going to learn more about what we can do, really resources to help you. And we also even have a white paper you can download that goes into more depth on everything that you may need to know, learn, and understand about podcasting. So Jan, anything else you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, absolutely. I would just reiterate what you just said. And I would add to say that there are other videos that are part of this video series we are doing. So I mentioned the one about formats, for example. If there are other aspects, other pieces of the corporate podcasting puzzle that you're looking at, that you're considering, that you don't understand, check out what we do, because there is plenty that we have covered and there is plenty more that we're going to cover in future videos and podcasts.